be up on the council's website. So you can have a look at it afterwards if you want to go back to any information. Yeah, or if you just so you're fully aware that it's being recorded. Anyway, a big welcome. My name is Stephen Bunting. I work for a company called Morrison Lowe. And it's a bit unfortunate that we're actually meeting by online means tonight, but unfortunately COVID has done that to us. We would like to be talking to you face to face, but it's not possible. Anyway, just before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of land and pay our respects to elders past and present. Anyway, I'm sure you're all wondering who Morrison Lowe are. We are a local government focused management consultancy with expertise in helping councils address various sustainability challenges. We've been around New South Wales for about 20 odd years and helped councils from some of the large metros to some of the smaller councils with sustainability challenges, either helping them solve their problems as much as we can before any need for an SRV or special rate variation, or then helping them once they've needed to apply for one. We're helping Snowy Valleys Council by independently reviewing their financial position and then modelling some options that might close the financial gap for them to become more sustainable. Purpose of, we're actually facilitating these meetings, and they're really a first step in quite a lengthy multi-step process that council's going through to look at various options to close the gap. And I'll go through that process at the end of the session. The session's about 40 minutes long, so it does take a little while. And it's really a chance to really inform you, the community members, around what some of these key issues are that council is facing, and hopefully enable you to be more informed about what those are and why they have occurred and what the solutions are, so that you can express your views on what you would like to see happen. As you've probably noted, participants have started off muted with video off, so attendance is largely anonymous. And it's really just to manage the background noise as much as possible. Yeah, if you want to adjust the size of the presentation, if you haven't found it by now, there's a view option with speaker view, and you can adjust the size there. If you can, wait until the presentation is completed before asking any questions. I know that's sometimes difficult, but it just may be that some of the questions might be answered further along the presentation. So if you do want to capture a question straight away, then you can use the chat function on your screen to be able to write in the chat box. And then you can do that at any stage, or you can raise a virtual hand. That's also an option there, and that will flag that you would like to ask a question later on, or you can text your question to the number on the screen, 0418 124 437. I suggest you write that down if you want to use that number. That's 0418 124 437. It'll come back up at the end anyway. Now, just to let you know that our knowledge, or my knowledge in particular, of the Snowy Valleys community is rather limited. Our work has really been around analysing the financial information of council. So you may have questions that are more related to operational issues of the council, or planning issues, or something that might have been bothering you. We'll endeavour to capture those, but I won't potentially be able to answer them. So we'll capture them, and we'll make sure that they're either a response is either posted on council's website, or if anyone's left their email address, then we'll message them directly. There is an option which we'd like you to do at near the end of the presentation, and that's to participate in a series of polls of some of the kind of key issues that council's facing, just to see what you think should happen. These polls are non-binding, and obviously they'll be forwarded through to council to help them with their decision-making process. The meeting will cover our summary. This is Morrison Lowe's assessment of council's financial sustainability challenges, the current situation, some of the background to the problems, options that council has, the SRV process itself, and what the next steps will be. There is a lot more information available on council's website, some background papers, and more information on the process. Just want to make sure that we all know this is meeting's not about a few things. It's not about the merger or the demerger. I know it's quite a significant topic for the community down there, but that process is a separate one. It's currently for the Minister. It's not about that community strategic planning process, which Council's currently going through. They're seeking your feedback on the strategic direction of the community, so it's not about that. And it's not about setting the work program for next year. We're not looking for work to, to try and bring back ideas to Council. It's really around just informing you. And the last thing is it's not about making a decision. It's really to give Council as much information as it can about what the community is feeling, so that it can make an informed decision, and then at some point during the year come back out to you with some of the more firmer solutions than are here tonight. I guess the real issue that's facing Council, and that's what all this information is all about, is this whole balancing of expenditure and service levels. So, I mean, the amount, the quantity, the quality, and the frequency of services delivered to the community really dictates the level of expenditure Council's required to set aside. And that in turn dictates or influences the rates that you pay and the charges levied for different services. So the whole purpose about this process is really try and get a good understanding about that balance between expenditure and service levels. Just to give you another bit of background is the Council is obliged to be financially sustainable. The Local Government Act requires councils to apply sound financial management principles. So that's including a fully funded operating position, sufficient cash reserves, appropriately funded capital program, maintain its asset base, and adequate resources to meet ongoing compliance obligations. That's not negotiable. Councils who fail to do that will cause New South Wales Office of Local Government Intervention, and they can intervene in a few different ways. But there's usually a stage process that goes through to try and get councils to solve their funding problems. The other thing I just like to sort of discuss, it's often a bit of a misnomer, but when we've done these facilitated workshops before out in the community, there is a perception that rates are a fee for service, so that you pay rates based on you getting a level of service. They're actually more akin to a tax based on land value, where land value is used as a proxy for wealth, much like income tax, or income is income tax. So it's a model to actually distribute community costs based on that land value or proportional land value to fund some of those community services that everyone needs, or to make Snowy Valleys a desirable place to live. So it's not meant to be a fee for service, as I say, but it's more of a tax or a more equitable distribution of costs based on land value as a proxy. And that doesn't mean that everyone has different views on how services should be charged because they have different access to services. But that's a really challenging point for any council to balance those challenges. So what about council's current position? I'm sure you've all heard about this. You may have read about it in the long-term financial plan. Firstly, this process we're talking about tonight is only dealing with general fund rates. There's two types of fund: the consolidated fund and the general fund. Consolidated fund funds not only the general fund, which is general operations, but it also funds some of the special funds, such as your water, wastewater, and waste. So we're really only just dealing with the general fund, which over the last 2 years has posted a net operating deficit of about 7.7 million 2 years ago, and last year 2.9 million. One of the challenges for Snowy Valleys is that its general rates only contribute about 18% of the total general fund rate, which is much lower than comparable councils. And again, there's some stats on the website if you need to have a look at that. Also, we noted that there's other independent analysis by Deloitte confirming the situation that council is in, and that's the council does need a combination of grants, SRV, increased fees and charges, and expenditure cuts to be sustainable. And our analysis, Morris and Lowe's analysis, is that over the next 10 years, that funding gap is in the order of $45 million, or about $4.5 million a year. If we were to have a one-off funding injection tomorrow, it would need to be equate to around about 37% increase to remove that gap altogether. You can see there graphically, it deteriorates from where it currently is on an ongoing basis out to that 45 million in year 2030, 31. Why has this occurred? It's occurred for a number of reasons, actually more than six, it says there, but the main one really, well, not the main one, but one of the ones is rate capping. And rate capping does tend to cause a problem over time because traditionally rates are capped at less than the annual cost increases that council faces. And I'll show you some information a little bit later about what those numbers look like and why that problem is causing so much concern, or it causes so much concern. The other thing is really around some cost shifting and increased compliance. And one example is the emergency services levy, which in 2020-21, that levy used to be in your insurances, by the way, but it's been shifted into your rates. It was 748,000 on the Snowy Valley communities, and that was about 8% of rates. Councils also lost two SRVs that ceased last year. That was around or amounting to 621,000, and it's identified that since about 2016, it's actually added new services or increased service levels or increased services that have cost an additional $1.6 million over and above what it was in about 2016. The other interesting thing, and it's a bit of a two-edged sword, is the new assets councils been building. Those new assets at $19.2 million worth has come by way of grant funding. So the capital cost itself hasn't cost the council anything, but the ongoing depreciation, maintenance and renewal costs of those assets does add additional costs. And because the council's added $19.2 million more than normal, it means it's added another $460,000 to its operating costs above normal. Obviously, with the current climate, it's lost income from investments. And the other thing we've noted when we were reviewing councils' services is that Snowy Valley's community is quite fortunate in that it has such a broad breadth of services that are offered. Everything from aged care to community transport, community development, all sorts of services that you don't find in a lot of regional communities. The problem, well, not the problem, the challenge with having those services, while they're great, is that they do increase the back of house costs that councils have to provide to support those services. And that exposes council to a bigger risk of service cost changes. Council, from our analysis, hasn't been just sitting there doing nothing over the last few years. It has committed to making efficiency gains of $600,000 over the next 3 years. It has moved from a cyclic maintenance program to a condition-based maintenance program. So rather than just doing it on a cyclic basis, it only does it now when it's needed. It's reviewed and adopted its sustainability plan that it's implementing to use its resources more efficiently. And you will have noted from the last long-term financial plan that it's recognised that this alone, or these alone, things aren't enough or aren't sufficient, and it's starting this engagement process around, so what can we do about it? There is an SRV option, but there are also some other options which we're talking about tonight. Just to explain the special rate variation process, because obviously that's one of the cornerstones of the solutions. The special rate variations are a government's preferred solution when councils need a rate increase above the rate peg. And they're not necessarily bad. I think there's a misconception about special rate variations out there in the community. They're just something that councils are required to apply for from time to time. They're a good thing from a point of view of community, because what it does is it encourages the councils to minimise costs and stick within that rate peg amount. But over time, as the rate peg exceeds, as the costs exceed the rate peg, it stretches and stretches further until it reaches a point where it can no longer sustain the services it has without the risks obviously associated with them. You can see down below, that graph down below shows you the principal problem is the rate cap is the red line there. If you look at what the local government cost index percentage movement is, The local government cost index is the basket of goods, much like the CPI that council uses. So it uses more bitumen and fuel than fruit and veg. You've got the local government award movement there, which is again higher, and the emergency services levy as a percentage of rates. So you can see there that generally, as a rule, the costs the council incur sit above that red line, with the exception of last year, that one of the first times it hasn't. But was noted there that a lot of that was because the rate cap was increased to allow for some of that emergency services levy. But anyway, there are two types of SRVs council comply for. There's the temporary one, which is what Tumut had, and they're largely to fund temporary problems like upgrading of facilities, fixing infrastructure backlogs, or things like that. And they generally expire after that problem's solved. The problem that Snowy Valleys has is it's much more long-term. There's just sort of $45 million hole over time. So it needs something more substantial and significant that remains in the rating base to fund that operation. You can see here what the cumulative effect of those costs do. And that's what I was meaning before. When you look at the rate pegs sitting along the bottom there, you look at what those operational cost increases I had on the previous slide were, and then you take that 460 odd thousand of new assets cost increases. So they're all new costs the council's facing. And then year on year, you start to build the cumulative gap of what's happening there, and the cumulative gap is getting larger and larger and larger, and that's essentially why councils find themselves in the problems after a while, is they just physically are unable to make the savings needed to address that. Council's current SRV has a scenario in it that is proposing to fund the financial gap through an SRV that was put out to the community for feedback. The community preferred an SRV option to accepting a reduction in services and service levels or a decline in infrastructure. That scenario talks about the path to a balanced budget of increasing rates of a compounded amount of 25.44% over 2 years, and doing some minor or some smaller expenditure gains and cost savings. But after we've reviewed the LTFP and allowing for the impact of the new grants that council's been successful in getting the $14 million for the pools at King Cove, Tumut and Batalo, and the new emergency evacuation centre, that's really added a whole lot more cost into the council's cost structure, or will when they're completed. So that's really now it means that the council needs to look at an SRV of about 32.25% over 2 years to actually get back to that break-even number. So Morrison and I looked at a few options in conjunction with council. We have come up with a range of things. There's a few things we've looked at that don't really make a lot of sense. Obviously do nothing. We've talked about that. Someone else will make a decision for the community, and that's always not the greatest thing when it comes to cost cutting. You can sell more assets and invest the money, but unfortunately investments at the moment aren't really going to return anything. Or you can rely on, potentially council could rely on increased operating grants. The state government is pretty stretched at the moment with a lot of things with bushfires, COVID, and it has redirected a lot of its funding into those programs. And I know there's a lot of councils out there would love to get more operational grant funding, but it's really pretty much a long shot. So we wouldn't recommend relying on that. So anyway, we've proposed 3 options, and they are options of a mix of SRV or special rate variation amount, and then a series of things we've called closing the gap savings, and these are things such as asset rationalisation, which is the sale, transfer, or disposal of assets, reducing service levels, transferring or ceasing services, that's always an option, increasing fees and charges, and each one of those has their own attributes, and some lend themselves to making more savings than others. So it really probably needs to be a balance. And we're going to go through a little process here. We're going to try and I'm trying to take you through what some of those might mean. Here's what we've suggested. We've suggested these 3 options. One is not proposing any closing the gap savings, but assuming that council or banking that $600,000 productivity saving that council is planning over 3 years. That would leave you with that 32.25% compounded SRV, which is effectively 15% 1 year and 15% the next year. That remains in the rating structure. Option B is that $600,000 worth of productivity savings, then another $700,000 worth of those closing the gap savings, a combination of those savings over 3 years, and that would leave council or leave the community with having to find an SRV of 12.5% in the first year, and then another 12.5% in the second year. Option C still has those $600,000 worth of productivity savings, but a lot more of those closing the gap savings. It needs to find about $1.7 million over 3 years to reduce the SRV down to around 7.5% next year and then 7.5% the year after. So they're the real challenges facing council. So those options could look something like this. You can see here when we've used a different portion of those different closing the gap measures. You can see that option A, B and C all have productivity savings. B and C then have varying amounts of asset rationalisation, changes in service levels, reduced services and increased fees and charges. So I'll take you through each of them individually, and then I would really like if you, and we reach the end of each one to just tell me or give me some feedback through a brief poll about, how you feel about these options. So the first one is to rationalise assets. Council's identified about $9.7 million of building assets that are either underutilised, non-core or redundant. That doesn't mean they're not being used, but they're not as important as they could be, or not as important for council ownership. There are things like the Cancoban store, Ross Corner Medical Centre, which could be sold and still be delivered by someone privately. There are other things that could be either closed or handed back to government or handed to volunteer groups. And there's a range of things that council identified in that $9.7 million, from the Tumbarumba basketball stadium to the Tulip Boys Club, to the museum, to the neighbourhood centres and things like that. So there's a range of different options in there. None of these have been decided, and what we're trying to do is just say, well, is sale or rationalisation of some of those assets a good option? As I mentioned, council spends around 4.5% of building values on depreciation and maintenance. It's a bit higher for buildings than it is for roads and other assets. So if it could save around $437,000 if it disposed of or rationalised all that $9.7 million worth of assets. But under option B, we've suggested or included that council would sell half those assets. So that's around $220,000 saving. And under option C, it would sell 3/4 of its assets, underutilised or redundant assets, and save around $330,000. So what that looks like when we take it back to those options B and C, that asset rationalisation component of option B, that $700,000 would be about $220,000, just half the assets on that list, and $330,000 in the $1.7 million. So I'm just going to ask you a little question here. My co-host Michelle will bring that up on the screen. As you can see there, it's just asking you on a scale of 1 to 5, how important is it to you for council to maintain the current range of assets it provides? 1, not important at all, and 5, very important. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd appreciate if you would lodge a poll vote there where you think it fits in your views, and we'll share those results later on or after we're finished there. A couple of people voted. Is there anyone else wants to? Yeah, there's a few more. I'll give you another 5 or 10 seconds if anyone else wants to participate. Okay, we'll go a small number in there, so we'll end the polling, and Michelle will show you the results. So on a scale, how important is the council maintain them? And there's a view from at least 2 of the people here that it's not very important at all, while someone else had a much stronger view that it's important to maintain at least most of them, I would suggest. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. And that is pop back in here. That's changing service levels. So currently, there's a number of ways you can change service levels, but one which we'd like to talk about tonight is particularly the one around changing hours of operation. Currently, council's customer contact centres, really customer centres, community services, libraries, VIC are open a combined 380 hours per week. And there are a number of other regular or seasonal services such as swimming pools that potentially could be reduced. It costs around $100 an hour to keep these, depending on what service, but to keep these services open and accessible to the community. But there are other things council could choose to do to reduce service levels. Some of them will be unpopular, but or have a significant impact. But you could do things like reduce the frequency of mowing, reduce amenity cleaning, or even roads maintenance activities such as grading, go to a different frequency or a different cycle of those kind of activities, a longer cycle between things. So we're going to use that example of changing current service levels by reducing hours as a sample to get your impression on. So under option B, if we reduce those hours by 6 hours a week, we would save $30,000 per annum. And under option C, if we reduce it by 12 hours a week, we would save $60,000 per annum. So you can see in terms of the contribution there to option B and option C in terms of closing the gap savings, they don't make a significant amount. So 6 hours in option B and 12 hours in option C. So not a significant amount, but you would have to close it by quite a large amount to actually get a larger number there. So can I ask, I'll get Michelle to put up the same poll and ask you to have your thoughts on how important is it to you for council to maintain current levels of service? Is it not important at all? It's a 1, or is it very important? It's a 5, or is it somewhere in between? Anyone else want to participate here? No? Okay. Okay, we only got a small number, so we will we'll share the results. And you can see there again, down the other end, it's not as important to maintain those current levels of service, although there's one person who thinks again it's reasonably important to do that. So that's great. Thank you very much. The next one, obviously, but the next one is ceasing or transferring services. This is a bit of a tricky one because under this one, this is really the one where the most opportunity lies, and it's a chance for council if it ceased or stopped services, either to pass the services on to back to government, pass the services back to the community in terms of volunteers, or perhaps a private operator. So if it was going to return the swimming pools to a private operator, or lease them out, or lease out some of its facilities or some of its activities and hand them back to the community, or stop them altogether. So effectively, but it basically means that council would no longer fund those services. That's the bottom line. Doesn't mean they would stop though. So services that can be considered to exit are those non-core services that council's not obliged to provide. I know they're quite highly valued in the community, and there would be certainly individuals in the community that would be severely affected if they were changed drastically. But a lot of those are community service activities, things like community grants and donations. Council currently gives out about $250,000 in grants and donations, spends about $520,000 on community development, spends another $600,000 on economic affairs and events and promotions, etc. So there's quite a large amount of money there, and other things like swimming pools, where operates 5 swimming pools, which cost the community around $1 million a year net. So currently, council spends around about $2.5 million a year of general rate money. That's net of any income it receives delivering these discretionary services that potentially could be transferred or closed. So obviously, ceasing 20% of those would close the gap by about $500,000. And this option we've talked about, on option B, we've talked about using $400,000 worth of services to transfer or close or hand back to government. And on option C, a much larger amount, about $1.2 million worth of services to reach that $1.7 million target. So again, you know, if you went down the path with this option, you would need something like $700,000 worth of savings in option B, of which you could make up $400,000 worth of reduced services. And in option C, 1.2 of that 1.7 million. But you'd still need those rate increases as well to close that financial gap. So can I ask you what your thoughts are again on importance around those particular closing the gap options for reducing services? So I'll get Michelle to put up the poll. So here it is. Yeah. So on a scale of again 1 to 5, how important is it to the council to provide the current range of services? 1, not important at all, and 5, very important. Okay, so we've only got a few people participating again, so we'll close the poll and share the results. And yeah, the majority of the people are reasonably open to or see that there is potential to close or change some of those services. So that's good. Obviously, there's a bit of a balance there, and council will need to come back to, is planning to come back to the community once it's made a decision on what the best solution is. The feedback. Okay, so the next and last one is user fees and charges. This one only impacts the users of facilities and services, and obviously offsets the general rate. There is a sort of a cap, so the higher the service fees you charge, the less likely people are to use them. So there is a bit of a drop off sometimes in usage. The higher the charges go. Council currently reads about $640,000 from general fees and charges for services like cemeteries, sporting facilities, community transport, etc. And these fees and charges don't cover the full cost of those services, so they're generally subsidised by rates. So if you did increase fees and charges by 10%, that's obviously $64,000. That will reduce the need for an SRV by. So under option B, we've suggested 8% there, which is about $50,000, and option C suggested 18%, which is reducing the SRV need by around about $110,000. So again, you can see those numbers in that option B there, that proportion $600,000 saving and 50,000 of increased fees and charges, and that $700,000 closing the gap options, plus the SRVs, and the same with option C. So I'll get Michelle again to ask you to tell us whether you think council should maintain fees and charges at the current levels. How important is it they do that? Not important at all, or very important? So 1, not important, or 5, very important. Got a couple of votes in. Anyone else like to have a say? Okay, I think that's everyone. So let's end the polling and share the results. Yeah, so you can see there that again, it's one of the options that people are either being neutral on, or it's not important to keep those fees and charges around about the same. So it's again, thank you for that, because that's a good feedback for council. And as we go through these series of meetings, we should be able to, I guess, get a good feedback for council about what their options are. So what does all this do to the impact on average rates? And you can see there what option A is. The change in average rate is around $351. That's for the 15 plus 15% rate increase over 2 years. For the 12.5 plus 12.5, it increases the average rate by about $283 a year. And for the 7.5% plus 7.5% increases the average rate by $170 a year. If you do want to kind of work out where the impact is on you, you can take this as here's a sample rate it's coming out shortly for the current year. You can see that the rates on this property, well, you can't really read it very well, but it's 500. The ordinary general residential rate, which is the general rate, is $554. So that's the only area where this SRV would impact. It would add to the GST, of course, but it would impact that rate only. In this case, option A solution would increase it by $83, that $554 in the first year, and about $111 in the second year because you have the rate cap chipping in. And an option C would increase it by $42 and get $60 in the second year. So as we're just winding up now, so I'd just like to ask you if you participate again just in looking at just a couple of your most preferred options that you would think council would like to use, or you would like the council to consider to close that financial gap. Michelle will bring up another poll here, and this time just pick your 2 preferred options out of asset rationalisation, changing service levels, reducing services, or increasing fees and charges. Anyone else? I've got a couple of people in there. Yeah. Okay. Let's we can close that one off now. Thanks, Michelle, and share the results. So yeah, so everyone's happy to dispose of some of those surplus or underutilised facilities. That's great, and then potentially reduce some services and increase some fees and charges. So again, thank you for that that input. Yeah, so I won't go over this again, but just recapping the options, if you could bear this in mind, please, because very shortly I'll just ask you to pick one of those options or another option to get your feedback on which of these you would prefer. But before I do that, there is an option of not to have an SRV, obviously. If council doesn't proceed with SRV, it will actually need to cut $4.5 million out of its budget, as I mentioned earlier. So what would that mean in terms of the initiatives we've been talking about tonight? So to find $4.5 million out of the budget, you would need to, or council would need to, make those productivity gains of $600,000. It would need to sell all that $9.7 million of assets that's got on that, that's identified as potentially underutilised or surplus. It would need to cut the hours it's open for service by about half. It would need to transfer or cease all those non-core services. That's pretty much everything in that area. And it would also need to increase user charges by 25%. And that would bring in around $4.5 million a year. So I guess I'm going to ask you now, I'm not guessing, but I am going to ask you now, of that, those options A, B, and C, and this option D here, which is no SRV, which one would you think is the most palatable from your perspective? What would you prefer? So again, if you can choose between A, B, and C. I promise this is the last time I'll ask you to participate in the poll tonight. Anyone else? Anyone who wants to come in? Got a couple there. So that's option A, 15 plus 15 and 600,000. Option B, 12.5 plus 12.5 plus 600,000 saving and $700,000 in service reductions, etc. Yeah. C, the 7.5 plus 7.5 plus 600,000 plus $1.7 million in reductions. And the last one is no SRV and make it all through savings. So well, let's. I think that's it. I think that's everyone in there. And yeah, so actually everyone voted or everyone polled suggested option B was their preference. So it's great. Thank you. Appreciate your feedback there. Okay, so where can you get more information? We've tried to give you a lot of information tonight. I know it's a reasonably complex problem, but there is more information on Council's website, some background papers and things there. If you want to know more about SRVs, around how IPART, the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, go about setting rate pegs or processing SRVs, or what councils have had SRVs and what for, then that's all on IPART's website. You can get more information by speaking to your local councillor or by calling council on their 1300 number. This is not the end of the process. What have I done here? I have actually closed out that. Yeah, I have clicked out of that. So the you can have your say. There'll be a short survey on council's website shortly, if it's not there already, and you can make a submission through directly to the council's website. There's a form on the page there. What happens next is submissions will close in August. Council will consider those submissions. It will determine what its preferred solution or solutions are. It has undertaken that if that does involve some sort of rationalisation of services or assets or service cuts, then it will come back to the communities and consult on those. In November, it needs to identify its preferred solution and notify IPART of its intent to apply for an SRV, and it needs to state the amount it wants to apply for at that time. Then between December and January, the council will need to seek the community feedback on that response that's given to IPART, and then after weighing up what that community feedback is, it will need to decide whether it wants to proceed. Either it's in February, either in a as proposed or as an amended form, and then between March and April, IPART will then invite the community to make submissions while it evaluates the application. So that will be an independent submission process where you can make your submission to IPART, and then in May, IPART makes its determination, which is binding on everyone, and that SRV, if there is one, would apply from 1 July onwards, 2022. IPART doesn't always approve SRVs. Sometimes it grants them in different ways than what's applied for. So that will, that's really up to IPART to decide at that point. So I'm going to really just open it up for questions if anyone's got any. Michelle, my co-host, is managing the chat box there. If you want to raise your hand and ask a question verbally, unmute yourself, or if you want to text that number there on the screen, I'll endeavour to answer your questions as best I can. So has anyone got any questions?
We haven't got anything in the chat coming through.
Okay. Well, as I say, if no one's got any questions now, there are, lots of ways to ask questions going forward. There's more of these sessions, as you may have noticed on the website over the next wee while, if you want to go away and think about it. You can then participate in another question on the council website. Is my email address. I'm more than happy to receive questions from the community about this presentation or any of the numbers or things in it there. And certainly, you're more than, there's plenty of information there, and ask your councillor or ask a staff member. They'll be more than happy to help you with your questions. So nothing else there?
No, we haven't got anything.
Okay. Well, And then thanks everyone. Thanks for your participation tonight. Appreciate all your feedback. I'm sure that'll be really helpful for council, and hopefully you're more informed to participate in the process going forward. Thanks everyone. Okay.